right. So next we have the fabulous Dr. Ryne Sherman. Ryne has been a great friend to PBC over many years, being exceptionally generous with his time and also collaborating with Peter and our research team on all things Hogan and the Hogan 360. Just a quick intro on Ryan. He is the Chief Science Officer at Hogan Assessment Systems. And before joining Hogan, he held several academic positions and earned a PhD in personality and social psychology. Ryan is an expert on personality assessment, leadership, and organizational effectiveness. And many of you may also recognize him as the co-host of the Science of Personality podcast, where he discusses topics ranging from X-Factor leadership, learning from failure, and managing Gen Z. And so today we're delighted to have Ryan present on the impact of when a workplace turns toxic and the hidden cost of toxic employees. A very warm welcome to you, Ryan, and over to you.
Thank you, Des. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. Thanks also to Sharon and to PBC, to Shane, Peter, Sally for helping coordinate all the events this week and also this webinar today. Really excited to talk to you all. Really value our partnership with our friends here at PBC. We're really fortunate that we have so many partners around the globe, but the relationship we have with PBC is really special. We are really committed to working with our friends here in the Australian and New Zealand marketplace and beyond, and we even have one of our full-time members on staff here in Sydney as well. So thanks again for joining today. As Des said, I am going to talk about the hidden cost of toxic employees. And maybe in some cases, the not so hidden costs or maybe costs that you are familiar with. This is what I'm going to cover over the next, say, 40 or 50 minutes or so. We're going to talk about leadership and talent. We're going to talk about the base rate of bad employees. We're going to distinguish between different ways workers can show up as bad employees. And we're ultimately going to talk about the cost of toxic workers. And I know Des will be happy to facilitate a Q&A session at the end. So I talk to Bob Hogan all the time, and he says hello, by the way. When we talk, the number one topic of our conversation is leadership. We know that leadership is one of the most important problems in human affairs. We know that when good leadership is in place, organizations win, nations prosper, individuals have more successful and happier, more enriched lives. When bad leadership is in place, organizations fail, people suffer. And sadly, if we look around the world, we often see that when bad leadership is in place, people often lose their lives. In the corporate world, we know that the CEO accounts for somewhere between 17 and 30% of the variance in firm financial performance. The only thing that accounts for more than that is the industry. So we know leadership is really important. We know who's in charge really matters. But today we're going to talk about something a little bit different. Today we're going to talk about employees. And mainly we're going to talk about the problems that leaders face in their organizations. So our sort of venture into understanding leaders and leaders' frustrations began with this interview we did with a tech firm CEO. This is not a picture of the actual tech firm CEO. You might notice in the back it says tech and CEO. Yes, this is an AI-generated image. But we actually did interview this tech CEO, and this is what the tech CEO told us. He said, I spend 10% of my time dealing with client-related issues and their problems. And 90% of the time dealing with employees and their problems, right? So only 10% of the time dealing with client-related issues, 90% of the time dealing with his employees' problems. And he said it would be nice if those were reversed. A similar account, this comes from another CEO. This is a CEO of a landscaping company who I was ran into and was talking with him about his company. And I mentioned to him, and again, this is not an actual picture of the CEO. It's an AI-generated image. I said, yeah, I mean, who has CEO on their name badge, right? I said to him, look, it must be so amazing to run your own company, to have such a successful landscaping business. This would be really great. And he said to me, All of my employees' problems become my problems. And so these two stories, I think, are best captured by some data gathered by the Center for Creative Leadership. So the Center for Creative Leadership interviewed 48,000 leaders across 7,000 different organizations, asked them to tell us, what are the biggest challenges, what are the biggest problems you face as a leader in your organization? And this is the list that they came up with. And what I'm going to show you is the top 5 problems reported by each of these leaders. And they broke it down by different leadership levels. So starting first with frontline supervisors, these are the problems that frontline supervisors reported: frustrations with time and people, difficulty managing, or the difficulty being a first-time manager, managing people, a deficient operational process, some issues around team performance, getting their team to perform, and their own personal improvement. Mid-level managers indicated that their own personal limitations were a problem, that they were working in a challenging business context, that they had an ineffective interpersonal style, that they had difficulty creating cross-functional influence, difficulty making other business units do what they wanted them to do, and they had challenges dealing with competing people and project priorities. At the executive level, executives told the Center for Creative Leadership that they had challenges with the dynamic business environment, strategic responsibilities, that their own interpersonal rigidity was causing them to struggle in their role, that they felt that their organization wasn't really ready for change and that organizational change was a challenge. And that probably their biggest challenge, the biggest challenge that executives reported, was that they had a real difficulty getting people from different business units that needed to work together to cooperate. Now, this is a great list of problems identified by leaders and identified by these interviews, but I've summarized or highlighted what I call the other people issues. So these are issues that these organizations are facing that really stem from problems that are caused by other people. And so what's the takeaway from this? My takeaway from this is that people problems are the number one challenge faced by leaders today. So this comes from our anecdotes with our tech CEO and our lawn care CEO, but also this was the key theme that emerged from that research by CCL. So when we look at this set of problems that leaders are facing, right? They say people problems are the biggest issue. What do we mean by that? I think there's really 2 critical issues. The first concerns attracting talent. Can we find enough talent? McKinsey famously talked about the war on talent over 20 years ago now, and that continues today. Over 75% of global CEOs, this was a recent survey done by Manpower in 2023, over 75% of global CEOs are concerned that they cannot find enough talent to fill the roles that they need to fill. So it's a major concern for leaders is finding enough of the talent that they need. But the second concern that they express when talking about people problems is retaining and engaging their talent. How can we keep our top talent here? How can we keep our top talent engaged? How can we keep our talent motivated? We know that engagement is the number, and Sharon talked quite a bit about engagement as well. But we know engagement is the number one predictor of turnover. It's the number one predictor of absenteeism. Basically, every single organizational outcome that you care about, and for most executives, that one of the key criterion is productivity. That engagement is the number one predictor of these things. If we look at recent trends in the news, you've probably heard about quiet quitting or quiet cracking. And these really reflect a sort of burnout or disengagement from employees. Gallup reports that about 1/3 of all employees globally are actively disengaged. And we have to distinguish that from sort of just not engaged, right? So there's really 3 categories. There's actively engaged, there's not engaged, and there's actively disengaged. We know that 1/3 of employees are actively disengaged. That means these employees are actively disrupting business, actively causing problems inside their organization, actively creating more work and less productivity around their organization. also like to point out that these problems are exacerbated or become larger for organizations that don't have a product. So if you're an organization that has a product, like if you're Apple and you have an iPhone, um, talent is important at Apple, but it might not be quite as important as the product, might not be as important as the technology, because people are going to buy that product even if the people and the talent isn't so great. But in organizations like investment firms or consulting firms where the product doesn't really exist, the product is the people, then these people problems, the inability to find talent, the inability to motivate and engage talent are even larger. So this brings us to one of the central questions for today's webinar about the base rate of bad employees. If leaders are telling us that they have a challenge finding quality employees, they have a challenge keeping their employees motivated and engaged, we might wonder, what is the base rate of bad employees? Well, let me start with a little bit of a baseline and give us a little sense of what we already know. We already know, and Hogan has spent the last 40 years studying leadership. We already know that somewhere between 60 and 75% of leaders fail to create high-performing teams. This has been true for at least the last 40 years. And it's sort of a sad truth because we know a lot about leadership. In some years past, you could have gone to a bookstore. I think they still sort of exist here and there, but you could go to a bookstore and they would have a section on leadership, and it's full of books giving advice about how to be better leaders, how to be more effective leaders. Yet this base rate of leadership ineffectiveness has not changed in a 40-year period. But when we look at non-leaders, turns out there's not so much information. There's not much data around the base rate for bad employees. I already mentioned that 1/3 of employees are actively disengaged. So that would be one way of thinking about this. Is one piece of information about the base rate of bad employees. Pareto, the Italian mathematician, many of you are probably familiar with Pareto, suggested that 20% of them, well, his formula, the 80-20 rule, he didn't actually talk specifically about employees, but his rule suggests that 20% of employees do about 80% of the work and vice versa, meaning that one could argue that 80% of employees are actually bad employees. They're not contributing much. They're only contributing that final 20% to productivity. Now, I think, as we'll see here today, I think the reality is more like a big chunk of employees are contributing minimally to productivity. A small percentage are contributing a lot. And there's also a small percentage who are actually contributing to unproductivity. And we're going to talk about that group as we go on today. And finally, if we look at some other sources, including the Society for Human Resource Management, suggests that around 10% of the workforce are toxic employees. So we're going to dig into these numbers a little bit today. But one of the things that I noticed in reviewing this literature, reviewing these data, these around base rates of bad employees, is that most research fails to distinguish between incompetent versus toxic employees. So another way of thinking about this is there's more than one way to be a bad employee, and much of the empirical work blends the two. Academic studies often will say these employees are toxic, or they're studying toxic employees, but when you look at the behaviors they're engaging in, they might not seem very toxic. There's a lot of value in trying to attract attention by saying you're studying toxic employees, when really you're just studying a different kind of poor performing employee. So we're going to try to differentiate between those two here today. So let's start with at least a couple of different definitions of bad employees. And I'll start with the first one, which concerns incompetent employees. And when I look around the literature, I don't really see anybody distinguishing between incompetent or toxic employees. So I've provided a definition here. Here is how I define incompetent employees. These are workers who leave work for others to complete, but don't create additional work. One way to think about it is, you can imagine your coffee cup, and there's the entire volume of your coffee cup is the amount of work that your organization needs to do. If you have an incompetent worker, there's some of that coffee doesn't get drank or doesn't get used up. Somebody else has to come drink that coffee. Somebody else has to come do that work. But there's not additional work being added. There's not additional coffee being added to your coffee cup. One example of these kind of incompetent employees is free riders. Now, I'm going to guess you can mention in the chat if you've heard of free riders before. I'll try to take a look at the chat and tell me how many folks have heard of free riders before. Okay, we're seeing lots of yeses. Okay, everyone seems to say yes. Okay, great. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the free rider problem in organizations. And economists or behavioral economists in particular have been studying the free rider problem for a really long time. They usually do this using what are called public goods games. You may have heard of these before. Again, these are very popular in behavioral economic studies. And it's a really simple game to play, and we can play it all here together. You can imagine that you have 10 coins, right? So imagine that you have 10 coins. And I'm going to allow you to privately invest your amount of coins into the public fund. Now, you're going to be doing it publicly because you're going to be posting it here in chat. But effectively, you can imagine you're investing these privately with me. So you're going to invest these coins with me. I will be the public investment fund. I guarantee you that I will double the total number of coins invested with me. And then I will redistribute those coins back to the group. So under this set of circumstances, what's the optimal investment amount? How many coins do you want to invest? Okay, one person says 7 or 8 coins. What do we think? Go ahead, put your number in the chat. 8, 8, 5, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 10, 10, 10, 5, 5, 5, 5, 10. Okay, great. Okay, so there are many people who have won the game, but no one who has wagered optimally here. Turns out the actual optimal investment is 0. And that might seem strange because if everyone invests 0, obviously nobody gets any gains. But I can show you this example, how this works in a really simple example. So imagine there's only 4 people, and 3 of those people invest all 10 of their coins. One person invests 0. The 3 people who invest their coins, that's 30 coins. I'm going to double those coins. That's 60 total coins. I will give those 60 coins back to the 4 people, so everyone gets 15 coins. The people who've invested 10 coins now have 15, so they've got a nice return on their investment. But the person who invested 0 coins now has 25. And so what happens with these kind of, this is exactly what happens with the free rider problem, right? Is that if everybody else invests, everybody else in the organization is investing, the person who invests the least actually stands to benefit the most. Unfortunately, all organizations accumulate free riders. There's nothing you can do to stop about it. If your organization becomes of any kind of size at all, you run into this free rider problem. But let's think about the consequences of free riders and how this creates organizational disengagement. Imagine we're playing this game multiple times and 3 of you give 10 and 1 of you gives 0. What are you going to do on the next round? Are you going to feel motivated to give 10 again? Or are you going to say, you know what? I don't think I'm going to give all 10, or I don't think I'm going to give all 15 now that I have 15, right? So this is what we mean when we talk about how the free rider problem creates disengagement. You've all probably been part of a group project in school. And during that group project, probably somebody did most of the work and some other people didn't do much of the work, and they got just as much credit as everyone else. You've probably been in that same situation in your work teams where someone has really skated by not doing a whole lot. But how does that make you feel the next time you have to work together? So this is, in a sense, the free rider problem and how it creates disengagement inside organizations. However, I think it's important to note that just because someone is a free rider, that doesn't necessarily mean they're toxic. These are people who are not drinking their share of the coffee out of the cup, but somebody else is coming along and drinking it. So let's talk about other ways that employees can be incompetent. Another way of understanding ways that employees might be incompetent concerns performance models. So let's look at a couple of performance models that Hogan has. One of our performance models is called general employability. Now, it concerns these three job characteristics. If you score highly on these three job characteristics, you will have a job forever. People who have people skills, who have learning skills, and have work ethic, these people are inherently and eternally employable, right? So what are those skills? Well, people with people skills are really good at getting along with others. They can build relationships. People with learning skills can learn the job very quickly and adapt to new circumstances. And people who have work ethic are those who can take instruction, work really hard, show up for work, be complete work in a timely fashion. They're reliable, dependable, can be counted on. It turns out that these three skills predict performance in a whole host of jobs. Almost every job, to some extent, has some involvement from these three skills. Some years ago, a former student of mine was applying for a job as a teacher in a school, and the school principal called me up and said, "Well, this person's considering being a teacher here. I'm interviewing. As for a reference check." Um, And I just have three questions for you. The first question was, well, does she get along with other people? Can she work in a collaborative team environment? The second question was, well, does she show up? Is she dependable? Can you count on her? And the third question was, does she learn quickly? If we have to adapt the curriculum, can she pick it up? Can she stay up to speed? So even this principal, even though they weren't familiar with our general employability model, intuitively understood that these were the three critical behaviors to succeed in this role. So that's one performance model. Another performance model that Hogan has concerns job-specific roles or job-specific profiles. And here we have 9 different job families. So what we've done at Hogan is we've looked at job performance from hundreds and hundreds of jobs all over the world. And we've said, what actually predicts performance on those jobs? And we've created job-specific personality profiles for each of those roles, for managers, executives, first-line supervisors, professionals, customer support, all these different roles. And most jobs can fall into one of these 9 categories. So we have different profiles predicting performance at each of those jobs. And people who are assessed on these profiles get a fit score for a low fit, moderate fit, or a high fit for the job. And so these are another way of thinking about employee competence. If I score highly on general employability, or if I score highly, I get a high fit on one of these job profiles, that suggests I have the interpersonal skills needed to do well in the job. Conversely, if I score low fit on these profiles, that suggests I don't have the skills to do the job. So thinking about these models, I went to my wonderful research team and said, well, maybe you guys can help me identify the base rate of incompetence. Maybe you can help me do that by looking at these performance models. And so what we did was we had around 60,000 job applicants. This was a global sample representative of the global working population who were applying for a job. And all we did was score them on general employability, and we scored them on those 9 job family profiles. So that's 10 profiles that these individuals were scored on. And then we used our standard cut rates for general employability. That's the 20th percentile. For the express profiles, it varies by the different job, but it's on average around the 33rd percentile. And then it was a very simple task. We just said for each person, you had 10 possible profiles you could have passed. How many did you pass? And the most important number we were looking at was the number of people who passed no profiles, right? So what percentage of employees or job applicants in this case couldn't pass a single profile? They showed low fit for all 9 job families and for the overall general employability profile. And the answer turns out to be almost 3% of employees. You could describe these job applicants in a number of ways. You could call them highly unemployable. You could call them low potential. I would argue that this is the bare minimum base rate for employee incompetence. The profile looks emotionally erratic, insubordinate, lacking drive, and I'm going to show you the profile here in a moment. But I say the bare minimum base rate because some people passed one of those profiles, but just barely. We didn't include them here. So when we're talking about people incompetent employees, we're talking about the most extreme version, right? These are people who didn't pass a single one of these profiles. And here's the profile, just to give you a sense of what it looks like. We see a very low score on, and this is, almost 1,700 people here, but we see a 13th percentile average on adjustment, 19th percentile on ambition, 23rd on prudence, 29th on interpersonal sensitivity, and 37th on learning approach. And we also see lots of emotional reactivity when we look at those first 5 scales of the HDS. We also see a bit of an inflated score on hedonism, which suggests that these people really are looking to have fun, have a good time. They don't want to work too hard. We see that low ambition score. They're emotionally reactive. We see disorganization with the low prudence score. We see insubordination with the low prudence score. We see a lack of emotional intelligence with the low adjustment score and a low interpersonal sensitivity score. Overall, we see that these individuals are really going to struggle to fit most job roles. Now, there's more than one way to think about this. One way to think about this is that these people can't be employed. They can't be hired for anything. Another way to think about it is, what are the jobs that really require high performance? We probably don't want to put these kind of individuals in those jobs. We probably want to find jobs where performance really doesn't matter that much, would be a good fit for individuals with this kind of a profile. But as a manager of people with this profile, we're going to have a lot of trouble. First of all, I'm going to have to be really clear about the jobs and the tasks. Then I'm going to have to remind them of their jobs and the tasks. Then I'm going to have to correct mistakes that they make while they're doing the jobs and the tasks. So again, this is why it's really important that we find a job for these individuals that performance just isn't that critical for. Okay, so that's incompetent employees. We think the base rate, the bare minimum base rate, is around 3%. But what about toxic employees? And here I think it's critical that we make a distinction between what's considered toxic versus incompetent. So the way I've defined toxic employees these are people who have created additional work or problems that need to be solved. So going back to our coffee cup analogy, these are people who pour more coffee into the cup and maybe even spill it over the cup, causing employees to have to come fix the spills, to mop up the spills that are now on the floor, right? So I think this is a critical distinction between incompetent versus toxic. And we're going to see some data here showing that often toxic employees have certain sets of interpersonal skills. Often the case is that toxic employees have talents that they are bringing to the organization that mask their otherwise toxic behavior. So what do we mean when we talk about toxic behavior? What actually constitutes toxic behavior? I did a web and literature review to say, what are the behaviors that show up when we talk about people behaving in a toxic manner? And we see things like bullying, harassment, micromanaging, dishonesty, manipulativeness, narcissistic behavior, causing threats or potential danger to others. So this seems like a pretty good list of toxic behaviors. And as I was reviewing this list, I thought, IO psychologists have been studying what they call counterproductive workplace behaviors, which is probably not a great title, but they've been studying this for a really long time. And that list of behaviors that are counterproductive, to some extent, overlaps with toxic worker behavior. And so here are some of those things we see in counterproductive behaviors: destruction of property, theft, drug use, inappropriate verbal acts, inappropriate physical acts. And not all of these counterproductive workplace behaviors are toxic. Things like poor attendance isn't necessarily toxic. That's more like incompetent. But a lot of them are, and I've highlighted those that I think overlap with what we would call toxic behavior. So the great news is there's a really deep literature on counterproductive workplace behaviors. At Hogan, we have lots of data on these kind of behaviors. We even have studies where we measured employee theft, where we actually just kept track of drawer shortages, how much money should be in the cash drawer versus how much money was. It was a really fun study. We actually provided them with a new profile, and they reduced drawer shortages almost by 100% when they started selecting candidates using our profile. But in any case, the point is we have lots of data on these toxic behaviors. So what did the data actually tell us? What personality characteristics are associated with these kind of toxic behaviors? And I'm going to show you those results a little later on. We have a white paper where those results are fleshed out and you can see all the data if you want. But here I'm just going to summarize the key findings. So we found that toxic workers showed low adjustment. And by the way, in parentheses there, you can see the specific behaviors associated with each of these personality characteristics. They showed low prudence, they showed high sociability, and they showed low interpersonal sensitivity. I think it's worth pointing out here that ambition doesn't show up here. Remember, with the incompetent workers, we saw low ambition, we saw low learning approach. We don't see that with toxic workers. In fact, toxic workers could be quite ambitious. Toxic workers could be really bright and show a high approach to learning. We also see an interesting pattern with the HDS. While we do see excitable and skeptical are high, just like we saw with the incompetent workers, some emotionality, some mistrust of others, we also see high bold, high mischievous, and high colorful standing out among toxic workers. Overconfident, a tendency to be too risky, and a tendency to be attention-seeking show up among toxic workers. So again, here we're seeing a very different pattern from the incompetent workers, and it's a pattern that isn't necessarily lacking in talent or skill. So this brings us to the big question for today: what is the base rate of toxic workers? And we already know, right, that incompetent and toxic workers do not have the same profile. And we know that, incompetent workers, just a bit of review here, about 3% of the working population, that's our bare minimum base rate for incompetent workers. We understand what that profile looks like. When we look at toxic workers and we use that profile that I just talked to you about, just showed you, we find that about 6% of the global working population has a toxic personality profile. And we're talking full-on toxic. We're talking meets all of those criteria, right? Predicts bad behavior on all of those toxic behaviors, not just one or two. And we're going to talk about the implications of that as we go on. So again, we think this is a bare minimum base rate for toxic employees around the globe, about 6%. So finally, then, what is the cost? What is the actual cost of toxic employees on our? Yeah, it's a great question, Brown one. Is there overlap? There is not much overlap between those two because we did require them to be different groups, but there can be overlap, and that's a topic we're going to talk about as we go on. We're going to talk about how to manage toxic workers, how to manage incompetent workers, and we're going to talk about how to distinguish between the two, but more about how some workers can show toxic behaviors, but not necessarily be sort of full-on toxic workers. But let's talk about the costs of a bad hire generally, and then we're going to get into the costs of a toxic worker. This is one of my favorite books. This book's probably about 25 years old now, by David Jones. It was one of the first books I read when I was getting into IO psychology. And this book really outlines the cost of making a bad hire. And at the time, again, this is about 25 years old, this book demonstrated that if you pay someone a $100,000 salary, that is a $1 million investment when you include salary, benefits, training costs, overhead, normal tenure, replacing that person because they were a bad hire. This is a $1 million investment. Now, for most companies, if you were going to make $1 million investment in a piece of software, this would be a really carefully thought out decision. There would be lots of work put into it. There would be committee meetings to decide if this makes sense to invest in. However, lots of organizations hire employees at $100,000 salaries and don't put that kind of scrutiny into those decisions. So this book suggests that making bad hires is really, really costly. If we go deeper into the work on toxic workers, this is an amazing paper done now 10 years ago by Michael Hausman and Dylan Miner, where they actually looked at 50,000 workers across 11 different organizations. And they were able to identify specific toxic behavior and the effect that that toxic behavior had on productivity, the effect that it had on relationships of other people in the organization, the effect it had on people leaving the organization or becoming disengaged in their role. And I've summarized the key results here, and I'll talk through what those mean. So let's start first with this superstar column. What they found, what Hausman and Miner found, was that if you hire a superstar worker, and let's say you invest $1 in that worker, you can get, if you define superstar worker as a top 25th percentile, you expect to get $1.95 in return for that $1 invested. If you define it as a top 10%, you expect to get $3.25, a top 5%, $3.88, and so on. So that's the return on investment for hiring a superstar, right? A top 1%, you get almost 5 times your investment. But what they also found was that if you avoid a toxic worker, that saves you $12.50 for every $1 invested in avoiding a toxic worker. In other words, you would need to hire 3, 4, or 5 even superstars to make up for just one toxic worker. It's more valuable to avoid a toxic worker than it is to hire a superstar. We looked at their data and redid some numbers a little differently to make it a little, I think, easier to interpret. What we basically found was that top performers generate an additional revenue in addition to their compensation between 7 to 19% of their total compensation, while toxic employees create an additional cost of 44% on their compensation. So again, thinking about that coffee cup, if your coffee cup is full and now you've got to pour 44% additional in there, you're really going to have an overflowing mug when we hire toxic workers. And I think what goes unappreciated here is that toxic workers often have strengths. They often bring those strengths to the table, and those strengths are why management clings on to them. Leaders say, you know, this person's really getting this done. And yes, I know they have these other problems, but they don't recognize the full cost that toxic workers are actually bringing in terms of disengagement, in terms of employee retention. Okay, toxic workers at scale. So let's talk about what happens when we scale up this total cost of toxic workers. It's actually relatively easy to do. We look at the United States, the average compensation, and depending on where you look, is around $66,600. There's 163 million working people in the United States. We know the base rate of those is about 6%. Again, we're talking about the most extreme, the bare minimum base rate of toxic workers. We know it's an additional 44% cost, and this is generated by 9.7 million employees. And when we look at that, it turns out that that is going to cost the U.S. $286 billion every year in terms of the U.S. economy. I picked Australia here because I'm in Sydney this week, and we know that if we look at the Australian economy, we can apply the exact same logic. We can see that the total impact of toxic workers on the Australian economy is 38.7 billion Australian dollars. And if we go further to a global scale, we can look and see that almost $1 trillion is the total cost of toxic employees globally. This is just 6%. Just 6% of the population is having this huge impact, huge economic impact on our organizations and on our lives. So what is the solution? It would be really sad if we just stopped there and said, well, that's it. So this is this is the bad news. Look, I think there are some solutions to working with toxic employees. Let's start with some things that we do know. We know that personality predicts every meaningful individual difference outcome in the world. We know that personality predicts individual outcomes. It predicts interpersonal outcomes. And for our purposes, we know it predicts social outcomes such as occupation, job performance, and leadership. In terms of job performance, a really great study done a really, really long time ago, 1991. This is one of the first ever meta-analysis linking personality. That is a study of studies, right? Aggregating all the results across many studies, linking personality to job performance. And what they found was that conscientiousness predicts overall ratings of job performance across a variety of jobs really, really well. And this was a good start study, but several years later, Joyce Hogan, one of Hogan's founders, and Brent Holland, I think, took it even further. They understood that job performance isn't just about a single rating. There's all kinds of ways that people can perform on the job. They can build networks. They can be emotionally intelligent. They can do quality work. They can have stress tolerance. There's all sorts of outcomes that employers assess and evaluate that are related to job performance that can be predicted by personality, but it has to be aligned to specific personality traits. You can't just say, let's have personality predict everything in general. It's, for example, stress tolerance, we know is going to be associated with adjustment. So that's what they did. They aligned specific job performance criteria to personality. And when you do that, you find much, much even stronger associations between personality and workplace performance. So we know that personality predicts workplace performance. We also know that personality predicts toxic behavior. This is how we built that toxic personality profile. Again, we have a white paper. We're happy to share with folks on this, linking personality traits, in this case, the HPI and the HDS, to a whole host of toxic behaviors. So personality predicts workplace productivity. It also predicts toxic behavior or counterproductivity in the workplace. So how can we fix toxic behavior? Well, we know personality is really very stable. So we don't think there's really much hope in fixing someone who has a full-on toxic profile. If you have a personality profile that is going to be associated with all of these toxic behavioral outcomes, there's probably not a whole lot of hope in trying to correct or fix that profile. However, we also know a lot of people have maybe one or two behaviors, maybe one or two personality dimensions that are related to toxic behavior. And here's where we think coaching and development can really play an important role. The approach we usually take is we say, hey, look, you have these behaviors and it's causing this kind of reputation. It's causing this kind of impact on your peers or on your staff. What kind of impact do you want to have? If you want to change that impact, let's talk about how we can change your behaviors in a way to get the impact that you want to have, to get that outcome that you're looking for. Ultimately, though, we think, and the data I think are really clear on this, that avoiding toxic workers is the way to go. If you can avoid toxic workers, you should do that. And we know because personality predicts toxic workers, there's huge cost savings for organizations, for entire economies by avoiding toxic workers. And with high quality assessments, you can do that. If you have a high quality assessment that can identify someone's propensity for being toxic, you can stop that bad employee behavior even before it starts. Now, if you have these employees already in your organization, offboarding is really valuable. Again, many managers miss this opportunity because, again, they tend to overlook. I think someone said here, the old brilliant jerk scenario. We tend to overlook toxic behavior because we'll see things like great sales numbers and we'll say, oh, well, that's wonderful because they have great sales numbers. So we're going to just put up with this kind of toxic behavior. But those hidden costs of toxic behavior are harder for managers to see. It's harder to know that this is causing employee disengagement. It's harder to know that this is going to lead to turnover for other people on your team by embracing or sometimes even promoting that kind of toxic behavior. I'll also point out that leadership has a central role here. This is why at Hogan we talk so much about leadership, because who hires these employees? The leaders. Who supports their behavior? The leaders. Whose job is it to call out these behaviors, to stop these behaviors before they take over? That's also the leaders. So again, we think it begins with both leadership and high quality assessment. That's the solution to fixing toxicity. Okay, I'm going to summarize with a few key points here, and then we'll have plenty of time, it looks like, for Q&A. So look, we know that employee quality is the number one issue facing organization leaders today. This is what organizational leaders tell us. They have great concerns about their ability to identify and hire quality employees. Incompetence and toxicity, these are not the same thing, right? Incompetent employees require backup. They require people to come and fill in and make up for their mistakes. Whereas toxic employees just create additional work. They overflow that coffee cup and they make additional work for other people to handle. We know the base rate for incompetent employees, the very minimum base rate is around 3%. And we know the base rate of toxic employees is around 6%. And again, these are bare minimum base rates. We think that probably the actual number or the actual impact of these kind of behaviors is much higher. At a minimum, though, we know that toxic employees are $1 billion cost on most economies and almost $1 trillion cost on the global economy. And finally, I believe that high quality assessments are the best way to combat toxic employees in the workplace. Thank you very much.
Ryne, thank you so much. As always, a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. The distinction between toxic versus incompetent employees is certainly a very important place to start for this discussion. And I also have to say that quantifying that free rider problem was, very eye-opening. We do have a couple of questions. So the first one is from Sarah. And she's asking that for the incompetent worker profile, are the numbers exact, or is there a pattern which we should look for?
I see. So in that profile, should you just say, I think the pattern is more important, although I will say the level on the HPI, I think is really important. So if I saw somebody with a similar pattern, but a elevated level on all of those HPI scales, like let's say the lowest score was a 60 on all those HPI scales, but the pattern was the same, I wouldn't be concerned about that. So I do think the level in particular for the HPI is really important.
Yeah. And then Stephen is asking about the percentages, and do you see the percentages changing at the leadership level, especially the 6% toxic? And when we think about leaders that drive for results, but then leave a train wreck behind them, is always the consequence of that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. We did look at job level, and we didn't find huge differences in the sort of level of toxicity. Of course, we do know that leaders have an outsized impact on the organization, and this is true in terms of toxic behavior. In particular, leaders have an impact on the culture for the organization. So when leaders promote or display toxic behaviors themselves, that creates a culture where toxic behavior is accepted and perpetuates itself. So that's one place where it's really, really important, where there is more impact of toxicity. I don't have any evidence that leaders are more likely to be toxic, but there is pretty strong evidence that people with toxic behavioral traits often do get promoted. So again, high bold is often a recipe for promotion, and sometimes those lead to those kinds of toxic behaviors that we saw on some of the previous slides.
Yeah. The whole leadership emergence versus effectiveness thing comes in there as well. And then Nadia asks an interesting question. So how would you debrief a person that has a toxic profile on their Hogan results?
Yeah. Well, look, here's what I would say, and I think Sharon actually made this point. Personality isn't fate, and so just because you have a profile that looks potentially toxic doesn't necessarily mean you will engage in toxic behaviors. Personality assessment is meant to predict the outcome, right? And there's no perfect predictor in the world. What I would say is, for that person, we know when they go wrong, this is how they're going to go wrong. So if they struggle in the organization, it is going to be because of those toxic behaviors that they're displaying. Do they have the ability to use their self-awareness, to use their knowledge of these potential behaviors to counteract that? Absolutely. We have evidence that people do that. but it begins with getting that self-awareness. So if I was going to be debriefing someone with that kind of a profile, those are the kinds of things I would be telling them. Hey, this is sort of a warning for you. Have you ever had feedback like this from other people? And they might not have, because quite frankly, sometimes toxic behavior doesn't lead to feedback. People are worried about the consequences associated with giving feedback, or they're worried that it's hopeless, that if I give this person feedback, that won't really do any good.
Mm.
They can probably give you examples of when they've been given that kind of feedback or they've run into those kind of situations before. And I would see it as an opportunity to say, hey, look, this is a potential warning for what might get you into trouble in your career. And again, thinking about the impact you want to have and how do you want to change your behavior to actually have that impact.
Thanks, Ryan. And then the last question from Natalie. So Natalie's wondering, about the impact of up to 6% of working age population with these traits running around without gainful employment. And what is the link with this type of behavior to
Yeah.
criminality?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? So what happens if these people don't have employment, right? So
Yeah.
I think the toxic workers are actually going to get employed quite a bit because they're going to impress on interviews. I have a really great example. It's from the world of sport, and unfortunately, it's American centric. It's the National Football League, or the other kind of football that's played in the United States. For years and years, there are players, typically they're in the receiver role, but not always, who are noted for having pretty toxic personalities, for creating a toxic locker room. But they're immensely talented. They're super fast. They're strong. They can jump really high. They can catch all kinds of balls. And time again, even after they get dumped from one team, another team will come in there and pick them up and say, we can coach them. We can fix them. Our culture, our environment will solve that problem. And time again, that person is let go again. And again, there will be another team that picks them up. So I think toxic employees and people with these kinds of toxic personality profiles do have a pretty high likelihood of finding employment. But to the question of criminal behavior, yeah, we know personality is linked to criminal behavior. And again, I want to emphasize personality is a prediction. It is not a guarantee. This isn't whatever that movie was. I forget the name of the movie from a long time ago where, they could tell you were going to commit a crime in advance. And, there would go. A
Yeah.
Minority Report, I think was the name of the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this isn't that, right? But I do think there is some risk. And so this is where I think it's important for societies to provide social safety net. We have to provide ways to maximize the benefits from our citizens and from our neighbors in ways that we can all win and all succeed.
And what would a robust evidence-based recommended assessment protocol look like, ranging from recruitment through to or throughout the employee life cycle? So example, what would you measure, when, how often, with who?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, our advice is to use whatever's the most predictive first. People don't often take our advice because they want to save money. But that's the reality, is that you should always start with, if you're thinking about a full-on selection process, which is going to include interviews, it's going to include perhaps even job performance tests or anything like that. You should use whatever's most predictive of your performance outcomes first. And it turns out personality assessments are one of the most predictive tools. So we always recommend using personality assessments as early as possible in the process, because that's one of your most predictive tools. It's also one that's totally unbiased. So we know you're going to get a fair shake at everybody right from the get-go. Whereas if we use a tool like an interview, there's potential for bias. It doesn't mean interviews are biased, but there's potential for bias to creep in. And so I would want to shift those as far down the talent selection pipeline as I could. But I think it's really important also that post-hire, we immediately start using the personality assessments to create a development plan, create an onboarding plan. With today's technology and the knowledge we have about job descriptions, you can really customize individualized development plans when you have specific job roles combined with personality assessments.
Yep. Yep. And then Ryan Ma, just curious about the recent research on trauma and how that shows up on personality assessments and as dysfunction in the
Yeah.
workplace.
Yeah, so I think people do. There is this intuition that trauma will affect personality assessment scores, and it can, especially if it was like very, very recent. But the research shows that mostly people sort of go back towards their baseline selves when they're taking a personality assessment. Personality assessments
Mm,
aren't meant to be context specific; they're meant to be context broad. So they cover a variety of contexts. They cover people over long periods of time. And so typically we don't see score changes with trauma. There's some really great studies done many, many years ago with people who were like uh, uh, they lost limbs. I think in
mhm,
particular it was paraplegics. I don't think it was quadriplegics. I think it was paraplegics, people who had lost limbs, and they evaluated their sort of well-being. And of course, right after the accident, their well-being went down, as you might imagine.
mm,
But within just a couple of months, it bounced back up to the previous levels, and it continued to stay at those levels for a long time. Conversely, we see similar studies with lottery winners. So people who've won lotteries, right, had
yeah.
these really positive events arguably happen to them. Again, you see this initial spike in well-being, but then it returned back to that sort of baseline level. And we see the same kind of results with personality tests. Now, that doesn't mean personality can't change and traumatic events don't have a lasting impact on personality. Certainly they can. Where I've seen it the most is actually with the MVPI, with values. When an event in someone's life really changes their approach to life, they really decide that life is about something different than they had always thought it was about. And that's where you usually see the change. It's more in the values than in things like the HPI or the HDS.
Mm, yeah, super interesting. These are great questions, everyone. We've got one more, Ryan, from Sharon. What about type 2 errors using assessment profiles? In other words, a person with the potential to be toxic, but
Yeah.
isn't quite yet.
Yeah. Look, as I mentioned earlier, there's no perfect predictor, right? People drill for oil. There's no perfect predictor of where oil is going to be. But you have reasonable guesses about where it is, and it's the same thing with any kind of selection process. Whether you're doing interviews, whether you're doing personality assessments, cognitive ability assessments, job simulations, whatever it is, there is never going to be a perfect predictor of workplace performance. Um, the argument, and again, this is made in the book Million Dollar Hire, is you're sort of like a card counter at the casino where you are making bets that on the long haul are going to make you make a better choice. You might say, well, maybe that isn't fair. What if you're wrong about that one person? And I think that that's true, but you could be wrong about that one person in a whole variety of ways. You don't even have to use personality assessments. You can be wrong about that person. If you're really worried about, total fairness, the only way I know of to be totally fair in hiring is either to hire everyone or to hire no one or to hire people at random. And I don't think that those are really realistic strategies either. So um, I think the best thing you can do is you use the best information you have available to make your best choices in hiring, and recognizing that sometimes you're going to get it wrong. Sometimes you're going to hire someone that you shouldn't have hired, and sometimes you're going to do the reverse. And there's no way of making perfect decisions all the time.
Yep. Yep. Thanks, Ryan. That's all the questions. And that brings us to the end of our virtual Thought Leadership Forum. So thank you so much to you and Sharon for sharing your insights today. And thanks to everyone that joined us online. We hope you're walking away with some practical ideas to take back with you. Also, just apologies for those of you who couldn't see Ryan's slides, but please keep an eye out for the recording and the resources that we'll be sending through to you. Our next webinar is scheduled for October the 8th, and it's all about customizing the Hogan 360. It isn't one to be missed. And in the interim, if you need any support using the Hogan Personality Assessments 360, or even looking to build your own leadership solution, please reach out to any of the PBC team. And with that, thank you all for coming and have a great rest of your day. Kia ora.